Back in 2016, I took an autism test, and the results that I got for it was like overwhelmingly autistic. It was like, dude, you are super autistic. And I took it a year later, in 2017, and my results were slightly better. I took it again in 2018, and it outright said, you are very not autistic. And so I know these tests aren't meant to be like a diagnosis or anything like that, but it stands to reason that with how long the test was, and with how detailed the questions are, and how it was based off the actual symptoms of autism, it stands to reason that I was exhibiting those traits heavily based on the results that I had gotten at that time. And I didn't jump to the conclusion that I was autistic or that I had some form of being on the spectrum. I just assumed that there was something messed up about me, but I didn't assume I was autistic. Um, I had a lot of doctors. When I was little, they told me they thought I was autistic, but I was never necessarily diagnosed. Um, and I tend to wonder, what difference does an actual diagnosis have? Because every time I've been diagnosed for other mental illnesses when I go into the clinic, it's always been a fairly standard procedure. They ask you a few questions and they say, do you have these symptoms? And depending on if you have those symptoms, they tend to give you a diagnosis. Like, all the times that I've gotten a diagnosis have been very fast. So what difference is it from just taking an online test and actually going to go get a diagnosis from someone? Because every time I've done it, it's always been exactly the same as taking an online test. I suppose the only real difference is that the person has a third party or neutral view of you. Like, when you're taking the test yourself, you may not necessarily be self-aware enough to accurately answer each question, which that makes sense. But I think I was answering them with quite a bit of honesty at the time. So I was more self-reflective than most other people my age. So I don't think it was that either. So let's say in a theoretical world, I went to a doctor and they asked me the same questions, and I said yes, and they said, well, you have autism. Um, what would that have meant for my identity? To say, well, I'm autistic now. I would have been treated differently by the people around me, and I would have seen myself differently. But because I didn't take that diagnosis in a literal sense, I just said, well, I have these traits, instead of saying, well, I'm autistic. I was able to effectively overcome those traits with enough work and practice. Because the problem wasn't that I had autism, it was just that I was socially stunted. I didn't go to any kind of public school until I was 12 and a half. And I was always able to recognize some degree of social undercurrent within conversations. It was just that I didn't have all of the tools to understand everything. And so I needed to learn what those tools were. So I put in a shit ton of research into, how to talk to other people just by getting in conversations and then analyzing them, or reading stuff online, or watching YouTube videos and podcasts until eventually I could get down the rhythm of how people talked, and I would copy what people would do in those YouTube videos and podcasts. And so this self-help approach, this approach to not necessarily go with one version of yourself and instead look at it through more nuance, was actually very beneficial to me in the end, because I feel like if I just said, I'm autistic, and then gave up, I would have continued acting out those traits, because now my identity would have been associated with those traits, and that would have been bad, that well, not in the sense that autistic people are bad. It's just that, like, it would have been bad in the sense that I would have taken longer to get to my potential. Like, people people are able to learn these things if they try hard enough. Like I watched a documentary about this woman like 5 years ago who was considered to be autistic, and then she quote unquote overcame the autism. Like she wasn't like that anymore with enough training. I can't remember the name of the documentary anymore, but my dad had described a similar thing, is that when he was young, he believed that he had autism, but he just read this book called How to Win Friends and Influence People, and he's like treated that book as like the way that you socially interact. Like he's always thought of social interactions in the context of that book because he just never knew how to do it before. It made no sense to him, and so because he read that book, he's contextualized the entire world through it, and he's never forgotten it since then. And so I don't know, like I don't know if a psychologist or a medical definition is necessarily the end-all be-all to describing these behaviors, because like I said, a lot of professionals in my life said I had autism too. And now when I go to see those same professionals, they tell me, "Oh, you know, you're very socially able. You don't show any sign of autism." And so there's a danger to it. There's a danger to identifying yourself as someone with autism and then having everyone around you treat you differently as a result of that, and you seeing yourself differently, when really the best way to overcome those traits is to see yourself like anybody else. You know, everyone has individual needs that should be accommodated for, but there's a certain point when you accommodate someone too much, when it actually becomes a hindrance, when you're enabling a certain behavior instead of helping them overcome it. I had to learn the hard way how to socially interact by putting myself in situations where I had to be normal. I wasn't put into a situation where I could be accommodated for being autistic, you know? I was always put into situations where I had to be a normal guy. And as a result of that, as a result of putting in that effort and trying to be a normal guy, in the end, I ended up coming out without showing those traits anymore because I just practiced. And I worry about a world in which people with autism are given this special treatment where, you know, they're treated like 5-year-olds. Like I've known people who have the diagnosis who, you know, they had to go to special classes, and, you know, everyone treated them like they were little kids, you know, like they were dumb. And this kind of infantilizing of an actual human being instead of just making them go out and experience stuff, making them try and be better as a person, to grow, to understand. I think it's really dangerous, because autistic people, they've always existed, they've always been here. It's just that back in the old days, because they didn't have a term for it, they were just eccentric, they were just a weird guy, and so they ended up having to deal with those traits on a pragmatic level because they were forced into situations where they had to be not eccentric, and eventually they learned how to act in a, you know, normal way. Like I said, my dad's a good example of that, is that he said that he had all the traits, but he learned how to, from reading books, how to act. And so I don't know, man. I don't know, it kind of grosses me out when I see this infantilizing of autistic people and them making it part of their identity instead of them trying to overcome these elements of their personality and try and, you know, and try and grow. Like, I've known some autistic people who, you know, I can't even tell that they're autistic at all because they've just worked, you know, they've worked to try and understand the social undercurrent of conversations. And yeah, you know, they were a little eccentric, they had some silly parts about them, but that only served to bolster their charisma. It didn't, you know, it didn't deter them from being interesting or good people. It was just like, oh, they're a little bit different. But they, you know, they tried to understand and to get better. And I think that's something that in our modern culture, because we're trying to shelter everybody, we're often forgetting that in the old days when people had these traits, they had to get better. They had to learn on their own. And ultimately, they were more strong because of that. Because the more that they struggled, the more satisfying the end was that they got to. And the more that they ultimately understood the world around them through experience rather than through, this 5-step program where everyone speaks to you like you're 4 years old. So, I don't know. That was my that was my story. That was my story of taking autism tests throughout the years. I don't know what I would get if I took it now, because the last time I took it was in 2018. And when I took it in 2018, like, I got very, very low levels on the test, like absolutely not autistic levels. And that was because throughout, like, 7 months out of the year of 2017, I think, maybe it was more, I went into a Discord call like almost every day, and I would speak in there for hours upon hours. Whereas in 2016, in the earlier part of 2017, I spent absolutely all my time alone, because I had dropped out of school. And eventually I did go back to school to leave again, but at that time, I only talked to people like once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks to record a podcast. I never really talked to anyone on an individual level. I just stayed in my room all the time, even pissed in bottles just to avoid the fact of having to walk across to go to the bathroom, which was stupid because I didn't have a door, so why would I do that? It's not that much effort to go to the bathroom, but I was a stupid kid. Oh god, not having a door back then, that was the worst thing. If you go back through my old vlogs, you'll find a bunch of vlogs of me complaining about not having a door. And it's good stuff. Oh yeah, one tidbit of this story that I forgot to mention was when I was little. This is very similar to Digi. If you've ever watched his videos, he talks about how when he was little, a doctor told him, "I don't think you have autism. I think you're a genius." And literally the exact same thing happened to me when I was little, is that I had this doctor who she had told, my parents were asking her if I had autism because I was very strange and eccentric as a kid. I liked, building the same blocks over and over again just to knock it down, and I liked lining up cars, and I would do the same things for many hours. And so my parents had asked them if I had autism because other doctors who I had seen suggested that I did as well. And this doctor told them, "No, I don't think your son has autism. I think he's a genius. I think he's very smart." And my parents just kind of went with that, which ended up being really bad for me because I never believed that. I thought that was absolute bullshit. There has never been a time in my life in which I thought I was a genius. It's always been, I hate how much stuff I can't do, and, I hate that everyone else is racing right past me. That's always been the way that I've thought. I don't think there's ever been a single time in my life in which I actually thought I was better than other people. And so it actually made my self-esteem worse because I knew that was not true. I knew that I was not a genius, that was bullshit. But my family, in a weird roundabout way, would treat me like that, where like in the subject of academics, for example, like in every other subject, they would just go, "Oh, you're boring, you're dumb," and all this other stuff. That's what I would be told. But with academics, I was like, "Oh, you're the smartest kid in the world, you know everything." And so I would literally cheat on my work because I was afraid of their perception of me as a genius being broken. And so I would just cheat. I would just cheat on the work that I was doing. And I did that from a very young age. I kept doing it. And so I had this habit of cheating on the work that I was doing in order to avoid the consequences of being told that I was dumb or being told that I wasn't a genius or didn't know, because I knew that they were wrong. But I didn't want their perception of me to be taken away. And so I had to find a way to preserve that, to not disappoint them. And so ultimately, the way that I did that was cheating. And I did that for many, many years as this perception was continuing to be propagated. I just didn't, I didn't say anything about it for the longest time. Um, and yeah, it's calling. This kind of ties into the point. Calling your kid autistic is dangerous. Calling your kid a genius is even more dangerous, because it just made my self-esteem even worse. Like, my self-esteem tanked after that point, which it was already bad. Which I'm talking about, like 6 or 7 years old. Like, I knew I was dumb back then. And so as the years went by, like, only till very, very recently have I felt that I'm relatively okay, like slightly above average in some regards, not all. Like, in most regards, I'm still not very smart, but in some regards, I'm like slightly above average. But for the last like 16 years, it's just been a constant. Well, 16. When I was little, very little, I didn't have any perception of these things. But for the last like 13 years, 14, no, for the last like 11 years, I've just had this constant perception that, I'm not good enough for this world, that I'm too dumb to navigate this world because my interests are too specific, or, because I just don't know. And it's been a constant fear that I've had. And, it's always in the back of my mind that in comparison to these other people that I may look up to, or that may even be the same age as me, I'm just not as good as them, or I'm just not as smart. And that felt like it got even worse as a result of them saying that I was a genius, because I knew it wasn't true, and I've continued to know that it isn't true. And like, it bothered me for so long. And I would really beat up on myself when I was little, like, even physically, if I made a mistake, because that's what I understood. That's what I knew. And so, I feel like an even more dangerous thing to tell your kids is that, is that they're a genius. Like, when I have kids, what I want to do is I want to gift them for doing specific things. Like, I want to say, if they got the work done, oh, good job, great job, you did a really good thing here, props to you for doing this specific thing. But I don't want to ever tell them that they're smart or a genius or whatever, because they'll get, their head will blow up. They may either think that they're really smart, or they'll think that they're really dumb, like I did. And either of those two extremes don't necessarily produce good people unless you're really lucky. And so I want to reward them for specific actions, rather than, just telling them straight up that they're a smart kid. I think that's a dangerous road to go down, man. You have to be able to reward someone for doing good things, not just reward them for existing. I know parents get excited about these certain things, or they get into the identity of calling their kid a certain name, or a certain category. I think that's just bad, I think that's just dangerous behavior to go down, and so I wanna reward them for specific things that I notice that they're having trouble with, that they got really good at, and I don't want to be like, yeah, good job, you did great here, and then I want to tell them why they did great, instead of just giving vague platitudes. I want to tell them what exactly it is that they did right, and then reward them on that specific basis, and then show that I really care and that I love them. That's another thing. I think, you should always tell your kids that you love them. Just always let them know, I am proud of you for doing this work. I love you, and you're going to do great things one day. You know, if you keep doing the work that you're doing here, it's very important to be specific about that, because if you're just giving vague platitudes, their imagination can take up the rest of the space that you had not taken up with, you know, more concrete words. And so I think it's important to give the specifics as much as possible, because if you give the specifics of what they're doing right, they can do it again to be further validated by the words that you're telling them. Not just think, oh, I'm great, whatever, you know? So I want to try and, you know, I really want to show them that I love them and that I'm rewarding them for specific things, because I can see where things have gone wrong in my past. You know, I can see what it is that led me to where I am today, and I think that's important to be able to see that, because the mistakes that, you know, the people in your life have made, you can make sure that you don't make them as a parent. You know, that self-reflection is very, very important. Oh God, this stopped being a rant about autism and more became a rant about child rearing and my past in general. Yeah, that was a thing.